In a typical year, hundreds of law enforcement officials line the Boston Marathon route from Hopkinton to Copley Square. They usually blend into the background, quietly maintaining order, but this is no ordinary year. Officers deployed to the race on April 21st will be on heightened alert, and their increased presence will help calm nerves still frayed from last year's bombings at the finish line. But as Edgar Herwick reports, there's a limit to what law enforcement can control.
Almost a year after the horror of last year's Boston Marathon, a sense of normalcy has returned to Boylston Street. But in less than 2 weeks, record crowds are also expected to return, along with new anxieties about security. Keeping everyone safe is a job that falls on people like Massachusetts State Police Colonel Timothy Albin.
There'll be things that you will see that, much more prominent security, and there'll be other things that you will not see, like undercover people, some of the technical surveillance that goes on and so forth.
More than 3,500 police officers will be deployed, twice the number at last year's marathon. And, of course, it all comes at a price.
It's difficult to put a dollar figure on it, but I would say it's fair to suggest that we'll be expending twice as many resources this year as we did in past years.
Because the marathon is a private event, much of the security expense falls on the Boston Athletic Association. But some residents say that even if public money is spent, they're all for it.
We're hosting something in our city, and it's just all like, if we have to pay for it, flip the bill, do what you got to do,
Vivian Grayling agrees to a point. She watched the bombs go off just blocks away from her Back Bay apartment and isn't sure she'll feel any safer with the increase in police.
I really don't, because if you have a will, there's a way to do anything, I think.
Jeff Gomer was at the finish line last year when the bombs went off. He's not sure if the increase in security will make him safer, but he does think it will put people at ease.
Seeing the presence of police officers at various checkpoints, I think it gives, like I said, that peace of mind for individuals.
That peace of mind is an important part of the equation, says Jennifer Lerner, who studies decision-making.
Even if the measures only ameliorated fear, that would be a good thing.
She says that fear and anger in the wake of a terror attack can cloud people's judgment, including that of policymakers.
If someone is walking around with an overall sense of heightened fear or heightened anger, and then that emotion carries over to color all of the judgments and decisions that they make, that's a bias.
Albin says he hasn't seen any bias, but that's a matter for others to decide.
When our elected officials or the public think, hey, maybe this is excessive, that's a decision for them to make. But for the time being, that's what our job is, and we'll do it until we're told otherwise.
And he says this year's security will be appropriate and effective.
Come out. You're safe. Come out and enjoy this day. Cheer these people on, and really cheer yourselves on, because we want to show our resiliency and our fortitude and the fact that we're not going to bend to terrorism.
Emily, one of the things that Colonel Albin had said is that a big part of the security plan is everybody who's going to be there at the marathon. He said, there's going to be all of these spectators, and they can be in more places than police can be, so they're asking people to keep their eyes open, and if you see something, say something.
You were right down there at the finish line last year when the bombs went off. You were actually on a day off. Will you go back?
Yeah, I would go back. Absolutely. There's no question about it. I think I'll be there this year, likely working it this year. Mm-hmm. But even if I wasn't, I think I absolutely would go back. Mm-hmm. I don't necessarily feel a sense of increased fear. The thing is security always seemed really good down there. There's a ton of security down there. And I think, and I spoke to a lot of people about this too, I think generally the feeling is that these were outliers. This was sort of a fluke of an act on some level, and the chances of it happening again are probably pretty slim.
Hope you're right. All right, well, my next guest attended a symposium today on the lessons learned from the Boston Marathon bombings. Brendan Kearney is the superintendent-in-chief for Boston EMS and was at the finish line last year when the bombs went off. Welcome. So is it different this year? Is there a different approach, or is it more of what we saw last year, which I thought was almost borderline excessive at the finish line anyway?
Well, I think it's going to be different this year. There's going to be a lot more police officers, security. There's going to be a lot more EMS personnel there. Not so much because there's an increased threat. I think just because of field size. There's going to be several thousand more runners this year. We're anticipating a lot more spectators that just want to come down to show the Boston strong attitude that the terrorists haven't won.
I think one of the concerns that some people might have is feeling kind of muscled by the police. You know, let me see your bag, let me do this, you can't go there, and the comfort factor isn't going to be there. Is that fair?
I don't want to speak for the law enforcement, but Commissioner Evans was at the symposium that I was at today, and he says one of the lessons learned that a lot of people are looking at Boston is just the approach the law enforcement has of community policing and things like that, that they have a very soft approach. I think Commissioner Evans put it very well, that if you go looking for a fight, you're going to get it. So they tend not to have the sticks and the helmets and the riot gear and things like that at major events, and I think we're going to see a lot of that in Boston this year as well. A lot of the increased police presence, vigilance and things like that, increased EMS presence as well. But I don't think it's going to be over the top. It's going to be to keep people safe and have that reassurance that they are safe in the city.
I know the commissioner feels that way. He actually wanted to run the race, but felt like he'd be criticized if he did, so he's not going to do that. All right, I'm going to bring David Ropeik into the discussion here. He makes a living studying risk and is the author of How Risky Is It Really? Welcome. And David and I, of course, work together at Channel 5. So, I mean, the chances, as Edgar was just saying, of something like this happening again. I mean, the bigger threat in the past has been the heat. Too much heat and people have heat stroke and that kind of thing. But the chances of something like this?
Well, risk is a feeling. Risk is not how risky am I. Risk is how risky does it feel to me, right? So there are a lot of statistics and a lot of how many of you guys will be out on the street and so forth. And somebody who was at the finish line last year is going to feel differently about exactly the same statistics as somebody who hasn't gone before, or somebody who wants to go and prove we're Boston strong, so they see it that way. Risk is emotional, subjective. Our perception of everything is subjective. And to that extent, it will be very interesting to see, and I would expect that most people will not be annoyed by the pushiness of the extra presence, because in this circumstance, the presence in their mind of what happened, low probability events don't remind us of themselves very often, but when they do, they stick with us, 911 and earthquakes and things. And this year, thanks for being here, guys, the reassurance, which some derisively refer to as security theater, the critics like to call it that. No, it reassures people enough to know that the people that we look to keep us safe are doing everything they can. Are they perfect? Will they catch everybody? No. Are they letting us have these wonderful celebrations? Yes. So I think those feelings matter more than the statistical likelihoods.
I was down wandering around before the race went off last year, and I saw Homeland Security, that big satellite truck over on the Boston, on the Common, the mall, Commonwealth Avenue Mall, FBI. I mean, they were all there getting their coffee early in the morning, and I'm thinking to myself, this is total overkill. But I can't even imagine how you could have more.
Well, it's a major event, obviously. Hundreds of thousands of people descending into the city, and at Boston EMS, we treat every major event like this really as a planned disaster. So we have the incident command system in place ahead of time. We pre-designate who's responsible for certain areas, and the law enforcement and fire services do the same thing. You'd much rather have all that infrastructure and personnel and planning in place and not need it, and Brendan, than not have it in place and try to gear up after the bomb goes off.
Let me butt in, because that's a real good lesson from this. With low probability, high consequence risks, since they don't happen all the time, our attention gets turned to what does happen all the time, and we forget, and we don't take them seriously enough. The reason that we had fewer deaths and casualties were taken care of, and it was so well handled, was because they hadn't forgotten that, and they did have the overkill last year. It wasn't overkill when we needed it, was it? So a lot of emergency planners forget to plan adequately for these low probability events. This is a good lesson that they didn't forget, and look at how important that was.
So, of course, the finish line is a whole other, because that's where the medical tents are, much different than the other 26 miles along the route. What's going to change there?
Well, without going into a lot of the details, but there are different contingencies in place to provide for medical care farther out along the race and things like that. Some military assets will be available. As I said, because there's going to be more runners and spectators, there will be more medical personnel throughout the entire length of the race to keep people safe.
All right, Brendan Kearney, David Ropeik, thanks so much for coming.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.